Professor, thank you so very much for joining. We are really glad that you were, I know you're super busy with so many things going on. So actually, really, honestly, I genuinely mean it. I'm super grateful that you were able to find the time to talk to me today. So I did a bit of introduction before about you and your background, but just for the general audience, please would you mind to tell us a little bit about um, your background and how you became interested in the field of your study?
Yes, thanks so much for inviting me to be here today. It really is my pleasure to share my experience with you. So I became interested in neuroscience, I think before I even knew what it was, because I was young and I heard the myth that you only use 10% of your brain. And I thought that kind of caught my attention. And of course, we know now that's just not true, but it's something that sticks in your mind when you first hear it. And so I think it prompted me to want to study more about the brain and figure out how it works. And so really it was kind of an innocent start without knowing what I was getting into. I thought, okay, let me spend some time thinking about this question.
So when you were very little at that time, wasn't it? You were
So
quite.
yeah, probably
Um,
10 years old or something like that.
yeah. We spoke earlier, so that's how I know. I know this thing. And also, there are podcasts that you have also contributed, which are great, which I will link down in the show notes as well. And you mentioned the human brain, which is something which, of course, you focus on quite intense, an intense focus, because that's a very important part of research. But if I were to kind of, as a layperson, if I would sit back, if I were to compare something, imagine that I would say that the universe is infinite, right? It sounds like a grand idea. It sounds so big and everything. But as a person, I can't really grasp that, right? But of course, universe is something quite, different. But the brain is something that we can, if a researcher wants to, can touch, scan, do all sorts of things to it. But even then, we know not so much about it, is what I understand. So in order to kind of compare and kind of give an idea as to how much we don't know about it, can you kind of give us a bit of a comparison?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one. I mean, I think if you like to quantify things, their estimate is that there may be 80 billion neurons in the brain, the cells that make up the brain. So 80 billion, this is just a number that's hard to even think about. So,
And that's what that means, right? Exactly.
yeah, exactly. Nobody knows what it means. Sometimes people like to compare it to, number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy or something, even though we don't know what that is either. So it's hard, I think, for us in our, understanding of numbers to really get a sense for how much complexity there could possibly be in the human brain with that many different cells and of course many more possible connections between those cells. So yeah, I think that's why it fascinates researchers and anybody to think about how we could possibly make sense of this organ so complex.
Absolutely. I mean, this has been, I have been, I'm sure a lot of the listeners know that there are podcasts from NPR, for example, which they talk about different, neurosciences and different functionality of the brain and things like that, which are great. The complexity is quite, when you talk about the complexity, it is something that is almost unparalleled, like with the regards to the functionality, but also that comes with the thought processes and consciousness, what that means, and all sorts of stuff, right? So there are so many different layers which we haven't still not much, we don't have much knowledge about, isn't it? So so if you kind of have that context around us, and if you kind of think about it from the perspective as a researcher, how do you start because it would be overwhelming to think about something as complex as that, right? And say, okay, where do you start? Where do you kind of think about to attack this problem and say, okay, this is where we need to focus on, or this is not as interesting as this other thing that is maybe, how do you kind of do that?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it is overwhelming. Where do you start when we have something that seems impossible to wrap your head around? So I think a lot of researchers start based on their own curiosity. There's different subfields of neuroscience. Some people study the visual system or the auditory system. They're just interested in how do we process things in the environment, and that's where they start from. And there's others that are more interested in high-level processes like language. How does the brain learn and produce language? What about multiple languages? How do babies first learn to speak? You can ask 100 different questions depending on what specifically interests you. So I think most people in the field start from a standpoint of their own curiosity. They might have something that's always fascinated them, and then they start looking at how does the brain do this? Because we can't, nobody has enough years in their life to figure out how the brain does everything. So most people just pick off more manageable chunks of questions and work on those for their entire lives.
Right. And are there a lot of collaboration between, like, say, for example, the auditory system and the visual system, and then I don't know, maybe the in the front or the actual cortex of the brain, or whatever it is that you might focusing on. There's a lot of collaboration between researchers, I would think, because otherwise you can't really, even though they are specializing on a specific subject or some very, very specialized area, you can't really. I mean, the brain is one organism. So I suspect that there's a lot of collaboration happening as well, especially under you maybe as well, and your teams, and in the university itself, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. It requires collaboration because you need biologists who study the actual tissues. You need computer scientists who can write algorithms that help us analyze complex data sets. And then you have, in fact, we do a lot of collaboration with electrical engineers, because when you record signals from the brain, at the other end, you need to be a specialist in signal processing in order to make sense of those recordings. And then you might want to collaborate with psychologists who work on different types of clinical conditions. You may collaborate with even anthropologists or sociologists when you talk about how humans behave in big groups and in society. I mean, the collaborations are just endless. Physicists, it just is, like you said, too big of a job to tackle for one area of expertise alone. So the collaborations are what really makes it fun and engaging, and it really sparks ideas that you might not have gotten. Like, let's say you're just a lab studying molecular biology, but you get some input from a psychiatrist, and suddenly you're developing a drug that treats Alzheimer's. So there's so many ways that collaboration works to produce both theoretical and practical insight.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say you are a top of this field, right? You are an absolute scholar in this area, and you're a professor of residence at UCLA. Effectively, your job is more like a conductor in an orchestra, I suspect, right? Because you're kind of juggling all these different areas. You want to kind of make sure that, okay, the biologists do this bit with their what they're doing, and then the machine learning people are doing whatever that they're doing. So you kind of need to know all these areas. How do you kind of deal with that? Because that itself is overwhelming, I would think. No?
Well, the thing is to never feel like you have to know everything. All you have to know is what you don't know. So, for example, if I want to start a study and I don't know enough about animal models of Alzheimer's disease, for example, I'll have to collaborate with those kind of neurobiologists. So you have to know more what you don't know, instead of thinking, okay, I have to be an expert on all of these topics. And because our lab works on autism, but we do studies in humans. If we wanted to extend that to, I don't work on this right now, but let's say we want to discover new drugs that help treat some of the symptoms, we would have to work with preclinical models and involve those investigators who are doing laboratory experiments in rodents, for example. There's no other way to do it than to collaborate. So basically, collaboration is a must in this field.
So that is one layer of the problem, right? And if you think about the next layer, which you personally have to deal with, is that because you are in the position you are, you also have to deal with other things like teaching and mentoring and like maybe working with spin-offs or whatever, right? So there's just so many different layers that I don't know how you find the time to do all that. I mean, that's incredible.
Well, you just decide which things you'll be good at and which things you'll just be passable at. So my job doesn't involve a lot of teaching right now, so I have more time, to focus on research. But I think you also do different things at different points. Like there was a
Right.
time when I did more teaching, and now is a time when I do a little bit more administration of grants and things like that. So I think your job evolves over the course of the years. So I'm not doing now spending my hours a day the same way I did 20 years ago. And I think
Right.
that's it's natural, for the career progression.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean,
Before I might
yeah.
have been in the lab analyzing data or going to the MRI to collect data or some things like that. And whereas now I more supervise the students who are doing that kind of thing. And then I'm more involved in trying to get secure funding and write grants and work in large collaborative consortia to collect large data sets. So I think the roles just change over the years. So no one person is doing everything at once.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I know your lab is, you're working with many different fields, but if you can, please do share with us a little bit about, some of the interesting finds that you have done so far. I mean, I know there's quite a few things, but something that's really stands out that you would like to maybe share.
Sure. So we are a human cognitive neuroscience lab, and mostly the way that people learn about the human brain is by using magnetic resonance imaging. So we put people in the MRI and maybe we ask them to look at things, and then we can see how the brain responds. Or we can just look at the brain while they're resting, while they're not engaged in any activity, and we can still see spontaneous brain activity that tells us something interesting about the organization as well. So we have been for a long time interested in characterizing how the brain is organized, and especially how that changes over the lifespan, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, older age, and also what happens when you have some kind of atypical developmental pattern, for example, autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. How does that change the development of brain systems over time? So, a lot of the things like you wish we had an answer, like we wish we knew exactly what happens in the brain of children who are diagnosed with autism, but we still don't. That's the tricky part is, even though we've had at least 30 years of MRI studies of children with autism, we still find some inconsistent findings, or we find changes all over the brain that are, not specific to one region or the other. And so I think that's the nature of the field. We start with a hypothesis and think, okay, here's what's going on. And we do many, many studies and revise that hypothesis. It turns out maybe we were half right, maybe we were totally wrong. It's just a constant process of revision and testing the hypothesis, refining the hypothesis. So for me, one thing that I thought I was sure of, that there was one brain system that if I studied it, this would reveal everything about autism. But as we studied this system more, it's a network of regions involving the insular cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, and we call it the salience network because it responds to everything in the environment that's salient or important to pay attention to. And I thought, surely this system must be developing differently in kids with autism. They often sometimes show overreactivity to sensory stimuli, for example, or are not responsive to social stimuli like hearing other people's voices or social interaction. So I thought maybe this system is what's impacted in autism. And so we studied it for many years. And of course, we found some evidence consistent with that. But at the same time, we found it was very nonspecific. So if you look at individuals with other diagnoses like schizophrenia or depression or anxiety, they also show differences in the same network, salience network system. So it's not a specific thing that, okay, the answer to autism, we just found something that is affected across lots of psychiatric conditions. So these are how, like, you start with some idea and then you realize, okay, actually it's not as keen of an insight as I would have hoped.
I mean that's how what you said is exactly that, right? You start from a place where that you start really accepting that you don't know something, but maybe it might be the case, which is the a reason hypothesis, and then you try to either prove it or disapprove it. But then the things that you find along the way gives rise to other people or other researchers to work on, like, just effectively stand on your shoulders to, reach to that next level, right? I mean, that's the whole point of research. And that's the whole point of, knowledge and understanding that we are trying to do for the past, the time of Newton until now, right? So that's really interesting. And we're still continuing after all these years, we're still continuing the same tradition and same, not tradition, but the way that we work, right? So Professor, it's, in this, I mean, you have been, let's say, you have been in this business for a long time, very long time. If I were to ask, Professor, what are some of the lessons you have learned that you might want to kind of, share with maybe PhD students or postdocs or even others who might be listening? What would, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it goes actually back to your old comments about your previous comments about collaboration. The lessons I've learned are that you just have to collaborate. There's no way to do everything yourself in this field where there's so much necessity of different areas of expertise, and to be open to collaboration. So, the Salience Network that I mentioned that we work on a lot has been now sort of explored in the area of addiction. So alcohol use disorder, tobacco use disorder, and also people who study pain and chronic pain and fibromyalgia are looking at this system for a way of, looking at how the brain responds maybe too much to some things and not enough to other things. So I've then collaborated with pain researchers or addiction researchers as a result. So it goes lots of ways, like some basic science discovery you make might apply to fields you never would have imagined. And at the same time, me, as I'm trying to work in autism, I might actually gain some insights from some of these other researchers in terms of methods or techniques or theoretical approaches. So I think just the openness to new ideas and openness to collaboration is the main thing I've learned over the years, that there's no way to do it any other way. And you'll just be shocked sometimes at the connections that you find developing over the years that you never would have predicted.
Right, and I mean, you may have seen the film Oppenheimer, which is
Not yet. I still need to see it.
It's very interesting. One of the things that they talk about is actually that I mean, you can look at the end result in many different ways, but in terms of what we're talking about, the research and discovery and trying to find things out, collaboration is what made something possible there, right? And it's not really about what you know, it's about what you don't know, but also what others might know, and building those connections to come up with something new, which is something which is really interesting and really important. So you are working on this research for many years now, effectively decades. You have been published, you have been cited, I would say, I think 36,000 times or more than that, I think. So it's accomplishment is something, in your field, that you are at the forefront of that. So considering that context, and you are in the US, you are in UCLA, which is one of the most top universities in the world. So keeping that context behind us or in view, if I were to ask in research currently, what you use, you mentioned a little bit before that, you spend most of your time, not most of your time, but a lot of your time, writing grants, applications, and that's kind of an important part of your job. If I were to ask, what are some of the issues that you find right now in your field with research, especially in the context of what we discussed? What would that be?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that in many ways we've just had a global pandemic that shows just how important, basic research is, development of vaccines. All of this can be possible because of the basic science that we've invested in. But I think still it's remarkable to me that we don't invest more money and resources towards this kind of research, both basic and applied and translational. We need it all, not just one or the other, right? Because, when people say, how did we develop the vaccine so fast? Because we didn't start from scratch. We already knew a lot of the basic biology. And so, it wasn't as if we just came up with everything within the last 2 years, right? It's built on decades and decades of prior knowledge. So I think I'm still surprised that we have difficulty securing money for our work, and we're constantly, most of us, writing grants all the time, and maybe getting funded for 10% of the applications that we submit, which is a lot of effort for very little reward. And then we take that little money and we try to pay trainees in the lab, we try to pay for equipment, and for all of the things that are required to do the study. We have to come up with that money, and either the government gives it to us, or some agency, or some private foundation, or we just run out of money and we can't do anything. So I think it's a pity that we're just not invested as a global society in the way that we're invested in military spending, or any of these other things where in the US, where the majority of the budget goes to. So I just think it's a shame that we have to work so hard to get so little money to do things that benefit society so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the reason why I mentioned that, all the things in terms of, your position and UCLA and United States is because we expect from an outside view, I know it's maybe not the case exactly, but from looking from outside, you would expect you would have an easier time compared to maybe somebody else from outside, maybe not from Europe, but maybe outside Europe, from Asia or wherever, to get funding, right? Because if things are hard to do in the United States at that level, then it's going to be even harder in outside, right?
Yeah, no,
So
you're
it's
right. It's much harder in other parts of the world. I mean, I have it easy compared to scientists in the global
right.
south, for example, or so I have a much easier time getting funding than a lot of individuals, and even still, it's a struggle.
Exactly. I mean, that's the context I would kind of want to think about, right? So, and that's a bit of a shame, because imagine that if it was different, and we because I remember this conversation. I mean, so that I was alive at the time, but when NASA went to the moon, they were talking about what a waste that it was, because why did you have to put a rocket into to the moon, because what was the point of all that? But I read that for every dollar that was spent in the moon mission, $11 I think came back, or $10 or $11 came back to the US economy, right? Which is because of all the things that they discovered along the way that helped advance science by like decades, because of the way that they did it. So it's one. And then you may have heard that there are certain conversations where people have said, oh, we had enough of experts about, let's listen to the person down the pub, and they might know as much as somebody who's been doing it for 20 years, and so on. So there is a switch in mentality which I'm kind of worried about as well, because it of course then ties to the funding and what the governments are doing, and because you do what popular thing, and so on. So it's a problem. And then the other problem that I feel that, which I believe is maybe, I mean, I don't want to, say it in that way, but is publishing as well, right? Because we have this idea of publish or perish, and people publish. I mean, people have to publish if they want to get tenure, or to get advance in their career, and so on. And it's a very a problematic field, even though, I mean, a peer review part, for example, and so on, has been happening for, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of years. The way that our current system is set up, there are issues there, I believe, especially from the consideration of the where to publish, the amount of money that we have to pay. Effectively, the taxpayer, if you're taxpayer funded, then I think we pay 3 times along the journey. So how do you feel about that issue in terms of publishing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, we essentially we have to publish our work. We owe it to other researchers and the public to say, here's what we did, here's what we found. So I think it's imperative that everyone publishes their results, good, bad, or otherwise. Because if you, for example, if you do a long clinical trial and you find some drug does not have an effect, that needs to be published, so that nobody is then going to waste time or resources on it. It needs to be published if it does have an effect. It needs to be published if there are side effects of the drug. Either way, it needs to come out in a report. So we have to publish. The question is now, who's kind of along for the ride, and that's the major publishers. They're profiting off of all of this because they'll charge the institutions for access to these journals. So they're making huge profits, and so I think that's one issue. And the other is they know that, for example, in the top journals, like the investigators maybe will pay to get their articles published in those top journals because of the prestige associated with that. And so they, the publishers can stand to make a lot of money off of this process. And then, we end up, as taxpayers or researchers, end up using that money just to put the article in a journal instead of using the money towards research. So it does seem like there's some areas for improvement there. A lot of things that are going on are to kind of help remedy this. There's these preprint servers, so a lot of people are posting their results online for free, where anybody in the world can access them. And there's some journals who are offering open access kind of models so that anyone in the world can get the results. But there's still these subscription models that a lot of the major publishers use because it's profit, it's capitalism, and they're going to make money off of it as long as systems exist. So that is how it works. People have to make money whatever way they can. But if we can make our research publicly available through using preprint servers and other options. The thing is, what people maybe don't even realize is that if you email a researcher and say, can you send me your paper, they will 100% of the time send you their paper. You don't have to pay, you don't have to go through the publishing nonsense. You can just ask, and that's how it used to be done. People used to send letters in the mail and communicate that way. So it's costly, but there are ways I think we can, as individuals and as groups, we can try to overcome that issues.
When you say that, I remembered something, which is I remember that I was looking for this paper and I couldn't find it because I went to my university. We could just get it. We didn't even have to pay for anything in that way because the university paid for everything. We were oblivious to the cost, as it were.
Right.
But at the same time, this is one paper, and it was not even available in Boston Spark, which is in British Library. I just sent a message to the professor who published that paper. It was an AI-AA paper, and the person just sent me the paper within I don't know, a couple of hours or something like that.
Right.
That hours, not hours, days trying to get that paper from somewhere.
Right.
So
it's the easiest way to do it.
Absolutely, and everybody wants to. I guess there's also a benefit in doing that because, of course, you're not asking for a paper just because, right? Because you're asking maybe it will be cited, and there are other things that comes with it as well. But at the same time, as a general point of sharing the knowledge is very important. So, and from the perspective of publishing, and as you mentioned as well, quite a different number of paper. As you say, it's a capitalist society, and of course, people have to make money, and that's true. There are efforts that are currently ongoing. For example, I think MIT Publishing is doing that kind of work, eLife and so on. Some people are doing that a bit different model and so on. Do you feel that the way that we can move forward is that, because one of the driving forces that the researchers are actually forcing to being published is that because this model is it's a framework is in that model, right? Because you have to publish, therefore you're kind of forced to publish, and therefore maybe the results that you might get might be a bit I'm not saying that they might doctor the results, but there is this pressure to kind of create things because otherwise you might not move forward. So how do you kind of think about working with that model? Because some of the things I've read is that instead of the end result, publish the process, right? Or you say that this is what I'm going to do, whatever the result we'll publish, regardless of. So it takes the pressure off of having to do that. How do you feel about that putting that so much pressure on the researcher to publish, which have all the consequences?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, because to advance in your career, you have to publish something, and some things in high impact journals and all of that. So that's separate from, the actual findings and what they mean for the field. So it's definitely a problem, as you point out. A lot of journals are adopting this registered report format where you say, okay, here's my hypothesis, here's the method I'll use, and you sort of timestamp it and say, as okay, here's what I said, and then they'll publish. The journal agrees to publish whatever you find, whether it's exciting or new result, whether it's a failed experiment, they'll just publish it, because then there's no more pressure to produce some result. It will get published
Yeah.
regardless of the result. And a lot of journals are trying this. We've been trying it too. It takes some of the pressure off, but you still have this kind of traditional feeling of we want to publish in Nature and Science and all the top
Yes.
journals. Yeah, you haven't gotten rid of that entirely. And tenure and
Right.
promotion committees are still looking at that and saying, oh, look at these fancy journals. So we haven't gotten rid of that culture entirely, but there's been a lot more focus on registered reports, focus on open science and data sharing and resource sharing and preprints. So there's been more awareness of the issue now than ever, but we still can't get away from this like tie that we have to prestigious journals. Everyone feels like
Absolutely.
that one Nature paper.
Yeah, absolutely right. All my problems will be solved
Yeah.
if I have one Nature paper in Nature, right?
Right.
Of course, it's an unbelievable achievement to get there and to do that. I mean, Nature doesn't publish anybody's. You can't just walk off the street and publish in Nature. Of course, it's a very important journal, but at the same time, that you're right about, that the all the things that it creates in that framework, it's creating a lot of issues as well. Not a lot of issues, in a bad way, but things can be improved if possible, right? So going back to your research, just because my background is in well, previously I was in data, in research, and now I'm in I focus on data. So I know that you mentioned a lot about working with different researchers as well as machine learning people and so on. So with this recent conversations about machine learning, machine learning has been there for years, but suddenly everybody seemed to be kind of focused on that. How do you feel that, especially the machine learning and AI coming into the picture of what you are doing, especially in imaging and other areas that you're looking at? And I know you have your team, people are working with the data as well as with AI. How do you feel about that, and where do you see it going?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of discussion about this. Everyone's scared that AI is taking over the world or something. But artificial intelligence, machine learning, it's all as good as the creator or the programmer. It takes input from whoever is creating it. Someone is creating these models, someone is training them, someone is giving them the input. It's not artificial and it's not intelligent. It's the the coder is doing all of the work.
The underlying data as well, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a complete misnomer in some ways. So that requires a lot more careful consideration of ethics and responsibility than perhaps we have given in the past. You can use machine learning in lots of benign ways. You can use it in lots of harmful ways. So the question is, are we training people not just to be good coders and programmers and people who can implement, but really people who think about the societal impact and implication of whatever it is they're creating? And you see more and more of that conversation going on now. In the field of neuroimaging, people like to say, okay, we're going to take this brain imaging measure and predict whether this person is susceptible to psychopathology, or we're going to see if they'll later go on to develop Alzheimer's or things like that. That's the practical use of machine learning in the imaging neurosciences. And we're still not very far along any of these applications, but we're getting better and better as the algorithms improve. But one thing that we're curious about, for example, thinking about in the lab is how well do some of these approaches generalize? Like if I take a completely white population, build an algorithm and say, well, these 60% chance of developing Alzheimer's in this cohort, does it generalize to another population of different genetic ancestry? Does it even cross between men and women? If you do train an algorithm on men, does it work effectively in predicting cancer risk in
Right.
women, for example? So,
Right,
all of
right.
these things are not, those are not algorithmic issues. These are like really the person has to think about these questions and design their study and test their algorithm on diverse data sets of human cohorts that are not just one type of person, in order to increase the generalizability and eventually the impact of the findings. So I think people are becoming much more aware of this generalizability issue in medical sciences, particularly.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, that's the whole problem, right? I mean, if we were to kind of think about from the perspective of data, if you have that data set, underlying data set, so it's not just a matter of, okay, we are training this data set with, as you say, let's say even not even white or, Asian or anything like that, but let's say North America versus Asia, or in terms of geography or whatever it is, those could have a significant impact, significant differences, just because of factors that we might not know, the hidden variables that are involved in that. So it's quite we're still early days. So it's not that AI can be used for everything. Of course, maybe you can, but the impact it can have is vastly different to neuroscience, for example, versus, I don't know, generating an image about cats or something, right? Which is kind of different, right? So it's quite interesting, but at the same time, it does have, hopefully it will allow you and your research team and everybody else to kind of move forward in a faster way, which is what the hope is, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Going back to, because I know we are running out of time a little bit, so I want to kind of talk a little bit about, I know you have been in UCL for many years, working in UCLA, sorry, for many years, and working in different parts of the university, and I would like to take this, as much as researchers, universities also provide that backing and enable researchers to do what they do best. So how does UCLA help you and your teams to kind of do the best work that they can possibly do?
Yeah, I mean, UCLA is a unique place. When I entered as an undergraduate neuroscience major, that was 1997. And at the time, there was something like 30,000 undergraduates on the campus. And it's just, so it's a huge place. I think right now, currently, there's more applications to this, undergraduate campus than any other university in the US. So it's a big, big place, and it's diverse. It's got students from all over, the world, and it's got a very interesting population. And that, I think, for me, that's always been one of the draws. It's a big public university that really seeks to take individuals, not just who are at the highest levels of society in terms of socioeconomic status, but really individuals from all over. So I think that factors into a lot of, and that's how you get, really creative questions tackled by diverse groups. I've always, sort of benefited from that environment that we have, as an undergraduate researcher, and then again as a PhD student in psychology at UCLA. Again, a very big program. Many graduates who go on to both academic and industry positions all over the world. So I think just, and it's a big metropolitan city, Los Angeles. So I think, I'm one of those believers that diversity makes the best science, and you get, more impact and more generalizable results, as we were talking about, things like that, from being in that kind of environment. But it's also always been very collaborative, as long as I can remember. It's been a place of, innovation, collaboration, and high level of trust amongst researchers. So it facilitates, it's not sort of a place where you worry, hey, is someone going to steal my idea? Is someone going to stab me in the back? It's just not that kind of environment. So for me, it's just always been, for training and being trained, and now training students myself, I think everyone benefits from that kind of collegial, collaborative atmosphere. I mean, for example, like my student, I did this when I was a graduate student. I would go to multiple lab meetings and just talk with different professors. And now all my students do that too. They go to multiple lab meetings. If they want to learn some genetics, they go to that lab and sit in on their meeting. It's just very porous. Like there's no boundaries between groups. And I've just benefited from that. And I think now my students continue to benefit from that.
It's an amazing tradition, right? And you keep that tradition alive, because that's what makes UCLA what it is. So in terms of working there, and as you said, kind of you've been there for a long time, what are some of the fond memories you've had in UCLA, if you can share one or two?
Sure. Well, actually, it's funny because I was there for a long time as a student, first as an undergraduate, then as a PhD student. Then I left for 15 years to do other things, postdoctoral work, and start my own lab. And then I came back 2 years ago. So I have multiple layers of memories from different phases of my life. And I remember when I first came, and I had to go down into one of the big tall buildings in Westwood, one of those towers with more than 20 floors, and I just remember being maybe 18 or whatever age you are, and I was just terrified. I was thinking, like, I can't do this. I don't know what I'm doing here. This place is too big. I'm never going to find my way. And I felt lost. And I think a lot of people have this feeling when you first come to a big city, a big campus, big buildings. As I felt overwhelmed, and I really did feel that way almost the entire first year, until I started making friends with other people in the dorm, having study groups, and finding your little clubs of people that you spend time with. And I think that first couple of months of like being overwhelmed is a part that we don't support enough sometimes with students. We don't think, okay, when you get there, how is that initial experience? How can we sort of lessen the shock? How can we make it so? And some people are coming, they're international. They may be from another country. They may not be very familiar with the norms. So I think UCLA is great because they have lots of clubs and communities like that. There's an Indian student union that's just enormous, right? I joined that in my first year. There's so many cultural and recreational groups that you'll find something that you like, and you'll join the group, and then you'll feel like you have some friends and a cohort of people you can rely on. And I think the largeness of the university helps, because there's guarantee you'll find something that fits for you.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I remember being overwhelmed, and then feeling like it was home, within that first year.
I mean, when you say that, I just also remembered something which might be, I'm not sure if it's funny, but so I came to the UK from Sri Lanka, right? And the first day, maybe the second day, you have to open a bank account because you need it.
Yeah.
So I went into there's a bank here called NatWest, right? And I went into the bank, and there was a very nice lady that is standing in front of near the till, and said, "You're right, right?" She said that, and I thought, yeah, I think I'm okay. I'm not sure. Is there something on my face? I'm not sure, but it's just a greeting to say hello, right? It's like, "You're right," kind of like, "Can I help you?" This is what she meant, but because I didn't know, right? I didn't know. So it's kind of like, oh my God, what's happening? So I totally understand what you mean, right? So, I know I'm so glad that we kind of discussed many topics today, and we are kind of unfortunately coming to the end of our time. So, just want to kind of go back a little bit to your research. Can you please tell us, if you are able to share, maybe what you're thinking to do next in terms of, I know it's a big thing that to talk about. Of course, you probably asked, but in terms of areas that you might want to kind of look into, if you can share, that'd be really
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So for many years, for about 5 years, we had a research program where we were studying the brains of children with autism. It's one of our focuses. And we were trying to figure out what in the brain enables flexible behavior. So a lot of the kids, have this part of the diagnosis, insistence on sameness. They want things to be in a particular routine. Maybe they want to wear yellow socks every day, or eat a particular type of food, or things like that. So we were trying to study the brain basis of flexible behaviors. And we did that for many years with funding from the National Institute of Health. And towards the end of it, one of the students in my lab at the time came up with this hypothesis, and it was completely independent. It was her idea. She had this idea that maybe bilingualism improves flexibility. The idea that if you have to switch between languages all the time, your brain becomes more flexible because you're used to doing this kind of switching, right? You're used to thinking in one way, responding in a different way, and that. So she looked at the kids. We were studying kids in Miami, and many of them are Spanish English bilingual. And it turns out the kids with autism who had bilingual families did show higher levels of flexibility. They were, better able to cope with changes in the environment. And that got us started in a new direction. It was something, I don't know anything about language. I don't know anything about bilingualism, but suddenly sometimes when you get students in the lab who come from different backgrounds with new ideas, they come up with something and suddenly you're off in a new direction. So we're just about to start data collection now. We're here in Los Angeles, where there's also a very big bilingual population.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to bring in children, assess their language ability, look at different tasks that test flexible behaviors, collect MRI data so we can look at their brain and see how they're, doing these kinds of tasks. So we're just off in this new direction of looking at how bilingualism impacts flexibility, executive function, and brain organization in children with autism. And I'm really excited to be doing this. I mean, we're literally starting next month. And so, yeah, it's just an example of how you never know which direction you'll end up going. And this, like I said, openness to new ideas, openness to collaboration, and having a diverse team really facilitates that kind of transition, just being able and willing to go where the research takes you. I've learned, I've learned so much just from following my students.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's quite. I mean, it sounds, just by listening to it, sounds really interesting. I'm sure you are finding it so exciting, right? To kind of embark on this part.
Yeah.
Sorry. The one of the in the last, I would say that in the last 10-15 years, some of the discoveries that have happened with regards to brain science and nervous system and so on, they haven't been as widely publicized in society or to know about. Just so that we can, just because we have this opportunity, can you maybe tell us a little bit about, just maybe summary about some of the kind of highlights about you and your team that may have happened in the past few years, and so that we can maybe highlight your team as well, that is of course doing an amazing job with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've definitely gone in the direction I just told you about thinking about the impacts of language on other kinds of cognition in the brain, especially in kids with neurodevelopmental conditions. We've also done a lot more, I would say, more of the basic systems neuroscience work, where we try to say, okay, how is the brain organized? What are the networks and the interactions between them? And just long story short, there's a lot of spontaneous activity in the brain that I think researchers in the past used to ignore or say, okay, that's just background noise. That's something we don't need to worry about that. But now we're starting to realize, okay, that background activity is structured, it's systematic, it can tell you something about disease states, it can maybe even predict future problems. So we're getting really better at characterizing spontaneous brain activity and seeing how its tracked changes in behavior and cognition. I think that's been sort of a big discovery in the field that everyone is now taking much more seriously. For us, it's kind of the opposite of what you think. Usually you think the brain fires, there's neurons fire, that activity is really meaningful when you're responding to something out in the world, and that's what we need to understand. But what is interesting is that this ongoing spontaneous activity affects your ability to react to things in the environment. It affects your cognition. It affects everything. And so now we're trying to understand the functional significance of that ongoing spontaneous activity. And for sort of, instead of ignoring that as noise, taking that as the signal and really characterizing that part of the brain.
Absolutely, and effectively, you're building on the work that was done before, and you're continuing that at work, right? So that's how it should be, and your team is part of that amazing journey. Just to go back into, I'm we're kind of I know we are kind of coming to the end of the time that we have. If somebody wanted to contact you in terms of your research for anything else or to ask for a paper,
Sure.
how can they be able to contact you?
Yeah, it's actually quite easy because I kept the same email for since I was an undergraduate. So it was just Lucina, Lucina at ucla.edu. It was very easy.
uh, and all the details and information about professor would be available in our show notes so we will have all that there, so you'll be able to contact the professor as needed, and just a final note, probably the last question I wanted to ask you is that we mentioned about your career spanning decades, doing amazing work and advancing science. If you have to kind of thank someone, or maybe many people, if you have if in this journey, if you have to choose one or few people, who would you want to thank at this point for the giants that you're standing on effectively to get to where you are? If you want to kind of thank someone, who would that be?
Oh, there's so many people to thank, but I can think of a couple that are obvious. My parents immigrated to the United States from Bangladesh, and I was really young at the time. But if they hadn't brought me along, I think it would have been a different kind of life and perhaps a whole different career. And so I have to obviously thank my parents for that. And then when I started, in the journey of thinking about neuroscience as a field, I was I came into the program under the mentorship of Ron Zeidel in the psychology department. And he actually sadly passed away 2 years ago, but he was the first person who gave me a chance and said, okay, let's bring you in the lab and see what you can do. And he was collaborative and open to new ideas, and, really got his students, into working. And he got me started working in consciousness, which is one of the most interesting questions in neuroscience. So I'd have to thank, those two groups for really letting me pursue this path.
Absolutely, and as you mentioned, it's your parents. If you didn't choose that path, it would be a different journey for you, and they could have many different points in your time in your life. Things could have gone differently, of course, but it didn't. And of course, all these people who contributed to that, you are, I'm sure, thankful. Thank you so much, Professor, for your time. I cannot tell you how grateful I am to being able to speak to you, because we spoke before and it was so interesting to talk to you about all these things, even though that I have no idea really, it's not my area at all, but it's just to listen and just to learn was amazing. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to make this series. And I'm really grateful that people are interested and want to learn more about the brain. That's what I could hope. That's the best I could hope for.
Thank you, Professor, and hope to see you again and speak to you again in a different episode. So thank you very much, everybody.